We are here right now for the public face, the public launch of the Social Metrics Commission, because I think there have been softer private launches, have there? Okay, there we are. So this is the public moment that it all goes live. I wonder how many of you were at the launch of the IFS, but then I did my homework and found out it was actually launched in the 60s, which suggests not many of you would have been. But of course, that went from being a modest and humble think tank to having governments of lots of different colours and stripes on the rack and terrified twice yearly when they did their economic announcements. It's a fact that right now in this town, the Treasury is the engine of policy decisions, and the IFS is the engine of accountability, and it means that my bosses at various news institutions over the years have always scheduled in the autumn statement, the budget, and then the next day having someone to go to the IFS. So they are incredibly powerful. And Philippa Stroud, Baroness Stroud, diagnosed that there needed to be something equivalent in social policy. And so we are here, not because I think you believe that there is, because of that Treasury driving policy decisions, not just economic policy decisions, and that relationship with the IFS, it meant that everything went through an economic lens. So that is what we're here to look at today. I'm here to draw out of both of you, who I have known for some years in various guises. Back when I was a Lib Dem correspondent at The Guardian, and you were nobody. And you went into government, you're Chief Secretary of the Treasury, and then you became both a Minister at the Department for Education and also at the Cabinet Office, a fascinating hybrid of a job. And Baroness Stroud, as was Philippa Stroud, you did how many years in government?
5.5.
5.5. Mm. So we want, all of us in this room, we want to hear from you some of your perspectives on how you measure poverty, how you try to do this equivalent task of the IFS in social policy. So I just want to start with you, Philippa. And that, before I do so, I'll just give you a quick run through of the structure, which is we will talk and hopefully hear from them some insights from being in the belly of the beast that is government. And then afterwards, Philippa will give us a 15-minute presentation on what the Commission's already done, and then we'll go from that into questions from you guys. So definitely be scribbling down questions, please. But I want to start with you, Philippa, and when you had the light bulb moment.
I think I first really wanted to build something like the Social Metrics Commission. We do actually have some people here from the Treasury today, so just to say, we do love you. During my negotiations with the Treasury, and I started looking at what created the economic accountabilities in government. And you obviously have the Treasury, then you have the OBR, and then you have this kind of thing outside of government called the IFS, which is a kind of independent voice re-evaluating whether or not the Treasury and the OBR's decisions are correct. When I looked at what was happening on the social policy side, I couldn't find or see the same sort of accountabilities or the same strength. So when we were making our choices in government and when we were making decisions about people's lives, lots of the information that we were getting was through an economic lens only. And I felt that we needed something stronger than that, which is why I first started thinking, could you create an equivalent of the IFS outside of government on the social policy side?
So when did you first think that?
I think it was a dawning realization. I first drew up a kind of business plan for this a year before I left government, but it was probably during mid-spending review negotiations, and then it was solidified in my brain when we were doing the negotiation over the 12 billion.
And did you yearn for it? Did you wish that you had it? Would you have did you think, I'd love them to be hauled in front of the IFS equivalent? I would have loved that.
I would love somebody truth-telling. And I think it's like, when you're in government, you can't get the messages out that sometimes you need to get out. to have somebody running the same numbers outside government with the same data sets and with the same information available to them, not having to do it by PQ or FOI, but literally being able to look at the same spreadsheets outside of government, was, I felt, really important for the accountability on social policy, because nobody had that information. And even when sometimes I would say to people, why don't you run the numbers, or why don't you ask for the numbers on that? And they would look, can we do that? And I would say, well, Understanding Society and the Family Resource Survey, they're available to everybody.
So civil servants who said, can we do that?
No, this is like people outside government. And I'd say that they're available to everybody, but you actually have to be almost like a trained analyst. I mean, I've got a friend of mine who's got a PhD in mathematics, and it took him 3 months to learn how to manipulate the data. So although it's in the public domain, it's not accessible to the sorts of people who need to be able to use it.
So before we get on to the heart of the matter, which might be the worst effects of not having had this over the last however many years. Is that me or is that anybody? Anyway, there we are. Can you just quickly give me your reflections on people trying to measure from within government poverty and what effect it had on their behaviour as civil servants? So the people who were coming to you and you might be saying, what effect will this have? And were they adept at it? Was it a new tool, or were they not adept at it?
Well, I think people were adept at it if there were policy interventions that could easily have measurable short-term impacts on poverty. So, for example, if you took a decision to cut some particular benefit or not index benefits to prices, then that could be quite easily costed. The problems were if there were areas where there would be indirect impacts on poverty through employment outcomes and education that required sort of analysis to envisage what the policy impacts would be. And also there was obviously a question about how much demand there was in government and from different parts of government for an evaluation of the impacts on poverty. And I think that wasn't often enough part of the discussions about key fiscal moments. And often that information needed to be squeezed out of the system by people. I can remember, for example, my colleague Nick Clegg often asking for that information before spending reviews or before budgets. But it was done as a sort of add-on on demand and sometimes rather unwillingly. It wasn't really built into the system, which was ironic given that social recovery alongside economic recovery was supposed to be part of the narrative, not just of the coalition, but also of David Cameron.
So where did that reluctance come from?
I think it came from a few different things. Firstly, I think that while Cameron had signed up the Conservative Party to the Labour poverty targets in prior to 2010 as part of the repositioning of the Tory party politically, I actually think that Cameron and certainly George Osborne didn't really believe in the poverty targets as they were set. They didn't really regard that as a serious objective. Their priorities were much more about deficit reduction, and part of deficit reduction was making large savings to the welfare budget, which were the things that were likely to have the most immediate impact on measured poverty in ways that would be very unhelpful to the government's narrative if having to confront poverty. The things that they were committed to, and actually were committed to on both sides of the coalition to tackle poverty, tended to be things that would have longer term impacts, employment interventions and education interventions, that wouldn't necessarily move the poverty figures in a helpful way in the short term.
Did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we wrestled with in government was that we had a metric which was basically, even though there were 4 different measures in the child poverty measure, it was basically reduced to the 60% median income in kind of conversational terms and in kind of political terms. And I think there just wasn't sufficient trust in that metric. And I think what that did was it provided politicians with an opportunity to dodge it. Because if you can rubbish your metric and make all the conversation and the dialogue be around fighting over whether or not it really does take 200,000 children out of poverty or whether or not it really doesn't take 200,000, and that's where your conversation takes place, you're not actually having to face the accountability of what does that policy that you're about to implement do to children's lives or adults' lives or whatever. And I think so much of that dialogue was centred on the efficacy of that metric and the ability of that metric to perform properly, and took away the focus on what's actually happening.
But David, if there had been a metric, say in some of these discussions that you two are talking about, and for instance George Osborne had been confronted with the impact of his decisions, would that have changed his mind, or would it just have made it even sharper? I think somebody's laughing, but would it have made even clearer the consequence of what he was doing that he knew and would have carried on doing nonetheless? Or do you think it would have changed his mind?
I think it would have been a bit of both. I mean, what we haven't come onto so far is the fact that we did, in a large part of government, agree a set of poverty metrics in the latter part of the Parliament, which were then vetoed by the Chancellor in particular. And he vetoed them because he was worried that poverty figures, particularly in this Parliament, would go in the wrong direction.
Did you say that directly?
Yes, he did, yeah. And so I think
he said there's no point having a measure we're going to fail at?
Yes, yeah. And so I think his concern then would have been twofold. One, that he would have been signing himself up to a target that he expected on his policies, particularly taking a large amount out of the welfare budget, would actually be a failure and therefore politically embarrassing. But also, I suppose, to the extent it would have been politically embarrassing and also forced to focus on spending money on the things that would have a poverty-reducing impact, it might well have shifted his priorities for other things that he thought were important, either politically or because he wanted to spend money on nurturing economic growth. So I suspect the effect it would have had and his concern probably covered both, that if you have metrics that you take seriously, then they do have an impact on decision making in ways that he would have found not always helpful to him, but also it would have been embarrassing given that he and the Treasury were expecting on the policy settings that he imagined he would be calibrating, that relative poverty would be rising for much of this Parliament.
But it sort of points to a bigger thing, which is he didn't believe, and perhaps a broader problem for these metrics in the future, depending on whoever were to come after Theresa May in about 20 years' time, but is that they have to believe that measuring poverty and what that indicator reveals is a political problem for them.
Yeah.
If they don't think it is, then they will see the metric and ignore it, won't they?
And I think too that I would agree with that, but I would also say that the metric needs to behave in the right way. So if the government does the right thing, the metric needs to reward that and move in the right direction. And if the government does the wrong thing, the metric needs to reward that, or penalise that rather, and move in the wrong direction. And one of the things that I think George struggled with was the fact that you can statistically lift children out of poverty by the economy constricting, and that statistically reduces child poverty, but actually as the economy begins to grow again, you can statistically put children into poverty. And this was a problem with the 60% median income. The problem was actually we should come up with something that behaves better and that rewards the right decision, not just become unaccountable for poverty.
And that's possible by having a variety of factors you're looking at.
Well, that's what we're seeking to do at the moment, is actually come up with a measure that genuinely, if the government does the right thing and invests in people's outcomes so that they move in the right direction, then the metric should move. It should reward that decision, so that you're getting the right interventions for people. That's what we on the Commission long to see. Haven't quite cracked it yet. We're 6 months into an 18-month process, but it is something that we really want to.
I think it's worth saying that by the end of the Brown era in government, when these child poverty targets have been introduced, admittedly firstly under Blair, they have become very heavily associated in terms of reaching them with increasing welfare expenditure, even if on something badged as tax credits. In other words, increasing expenditure on means-tested benefits. And that was getting more difficult to do because of the state of the economy and the public finances. But there was also a worry about the sustainability of it with the public in terms of work incentives and in terms of the impact of expenditure on welfare versus other opportunity enhancing measures such as employment or education. So I don't think there was any acceptance on the part of Cameron or Osborne, and to some extent it wasn't our priority as Liberal Democrats either, to spend money, extra money, meeting the poverty targets on means-tested benefits. And indeed the pressure, of course, was completely the opposite way, because the Treasury was looking to make large savings to the welfare budget in order to deliver on the deficit reduction targets. And it's very difficult to reduce welfare expenditure without increasing poverty, unless you target groups like rich pensioners, who the Prime Minister had already committed not to target in terms of taking away things like the winter heating allowance. So that not only meant it was difficult to go on doing what Gordon Brown had sought to do through tax credits, but actually the pressure was from the Treasury was to make things worse.
Can you each give me one example of where having these metrics would have changed a lot?
Yeah, I think two things would have been two impacts. Firstly, every time we came to consider issues about the reduction of the welfare budget, we would have had routinely figures showing the impact on poverty, and we would have had to measure that against commitments that the government had signed up to. Now that happened occasionally, and I can remember Nick Clegg occasionally asking for the data and wringing it out of the Treasury and sometimes maybe even the DWP on what would be the impact of these proposed welfare cuts. But it was a sort of special request that took a lot of energy to get stuff out.
And what are examples of that, getting that data, changing things?
In having implemented that I think one good example would be 2011, when the inflation rate was incredibly high. The CPI rate, I think, had got to 5.2%.
I think I did that story.
You probably did. Yes, I didn't leak it to you. There was an active debate in government about whether to index by 5.2%, which would cost a hell of a lot of money and also mean that welfare benefits were going up faster than wages, or whether to have no indexation at all, in which case you'd have a large increase in poverty. Nick, actually, my recollection, asked for the impact of that on poverty statistics and decided that it would be such a big impact because it would essentially be a 5% reduction of the real incomes of people reliant upon benefits, that it would have a very big impact on relative poverty, and therefore vetoed it against the views of many other people in the government. I think also that when I think of all the fiscal statements that we had in the government, in the coalition, and these things come up, as you all know now, remarkably frequently, given the autumn statement as a sort of second budget. I can remember numerous discussions about priorities for those fiscal statements, and you would have thought that social recovery and poverty reduction measures, including long-term poverty reduction, would have been centre stage in those discussions. But actually, I can't remember them very often being. I think the priorities were deficit reduction. They were manifesto policy commitments implementing. They were growth enhancing measures, particularly before 2013 when there were growth problems. And they were probably popular things to do, particularly when elections were looming up. But was the consideration of social recovery and the metrics that would underlie it an important part of those discussions about prioritising big shifts in government spending? Almost never, I think, was the truth.
So that anecdote about the 2011 decision on benefits and whether to uplift them, uprate them. What was the reaction from the Treasury and or Osborne? Was it you're being indulgent about what it would do to poverty, or was it that's a Lib Dem thing to care about, but our people don't care about it? Or are they caricatures and they understood it, but they thought that we're hacking back the deficit and the debt needs more?
I don't remember being in a discussion with anybody like Osborne, but I think that from what I know, Philippa can then fill in the real detail. From what I know, the reaction were two things. One, you must be insane. Why would we want to? This is a huge pressure on expenditure when we're trying to reduce the deficits. And secondly, and I think Ian had this concern as well, if we're trying to help to get people into employment, and we're giving a 5.2% up rating to people on benefits, while people in employment have their incomes frozen, in some cases, reduced quite significantly particularly before 2010. Isn't this creating an incentive to be out of work rather than in work? And that comes back to these choices that you have to make between what your long-term strategy is for social recovery and poverty reduction and the things in the short term that are likely to most move the metrics, which usually will involve giving people more money directly in things like means-tested benefits and tax credits.
Now, I think that second part of what David has just said is where the debate was, is if you do this for people who are out of work, what are you doing to your work incentives? And there was very real concern that we're in the middle of the battle for universal credit, the reward work strategy, and at the same time it looked as though we were in danger of making a decision that was kind of a little bit schizophrenic. But just to go back to your question about going back over decisions when these sort of metrics would have been useful. What I look back at the amount of money that was spent, budget, spending review, budget, spending review, budget, spending review, on something like conditionality. And you had like 200 million spent one, 400 million another, 200 million another, 400 million another. And it got to the point where you couldn't really argue that another layer of conditionality was really delivering anything in terms of change of behaviour from people. And yet, because there was no metric that said this isn't the best place to, if your stated intention is this policy objective, this isn't the right thing to be doing with this money. You should be doing A, B, or C. And the objective of these new metrics would be that accountability. If you've got £400 million to spend, and if your desired objective is to support disadvantaged people into work, you are not getting the bang for your buck by investing it in that way. Another illustration of how this metric would help would be a new metric would help would be, for instance, in the raising of the national living wage. Statistically, the national living wage will actually increase poverty rates because it rewards second earners in a family. Well, it rewards anyone on the national living wage, but there's a greater proportion of second earners. So that's a wrong way for a poverty metric to behave. You want governments to be rewarded for increasing the wages of its lowest earners if work is your route out of poverty. So these are just some of the interesting behaviours that a new poverty metric with the right dynamics in it would really help.
Are you confident you can find those metrics?
We're working hard on it. As I say, we're six months into an 18-month run.
It's proving difficult.
Is it proving difficult? I think there's extraordinary unanimity amongst the commissioners. I mean, that's been one of the real privileges of this journey. We've deliberately put a commission together of those on the left and the right in political views and of no political view, just for those who wouldn't put themselves into either bucket. And the reason why we've done this is we want, if we come up with really decent metrics that can be used, we want them to have longevity. We don't want this political football again. And we want the Conservatives as much to own these as we want the left to own these and the Liberal Democrats to own these. We want there to be a sense of, yes, these genuinely reward the right behaviours.
So what would you say are the policy decisions that might prove quite troubling for the metric the day after a budget or an autumn statement? And for instance, I don't know whether it will come in the purview of the metrics, but something like grammar schools. If there was a decision on grammar schools, what does that do to life chances? On the one hand, you could say that for the children that go to that school that are lucky enough, it's good. For the children in the wider area, it might be more troubling. Is that something that you wouldn't touch, or you would possibly touch and might find quite a demanding thing to call?
No, we would touch it. So, I mean, the grammar schools is quite an interesting question in that it all depends how the policy is done. So it's not necessarily a right or a wrong, but are kids from disadvantaged backgrounds given the support to prepare for the exams? If they've got the potential, who's supporting them from the age of 5 all the way through so that actually they can take advantage of those educational opportunities? If that pipeline policy is not present, then actually it's not going to help them. It just becomes kids that get cheated. But if there's a proper policy and strategy right the way through, it's not going to be the answer, but is it a small contributor?
And what about you, David? What would you feel were the most challenging? I mean, is there something you did in government that you were certain was the right thing to do, but you're not sure would have necessarily had a glowing write-up from the poverty metrics?
Possibly.
Like what?
One thing that I was going to say before you gently prompted me to self-criticism is that one of the tensions there will be is when governments want to help people. This may be quite a topical thing. They want to help people who are in groups that wouldn't be considered affluent,
but nor are they poor.
But they won't be in the poorest section of the population.
You're talking about the jams. I know.
Yes, sorry.
Yes. Which you guys called Alarm Clock Britain.
Yeah, so some of the things we did, raising the personal income tax allowance, it did help some poor people, but it also helped a lot of people on lower incomes in work who wouldn't have been part of the poverty statistics. We were discussing the other day the impact of the living wage and whether that could widen some definitions of poverty. So there will be some times when governments want to do things which seem to be both popular and progressive, but might not have positive impacts. Sometimes they might even have negative impacts on the poverty figures in some of the ways that sometimes previously were seen to undermine the credibility of those figures because they had counterintuitive results. But I think the other big tension is that there'll always be a difference in views between political parties over acceptable and unacceptable ways of countering poverty, particularly over this issue of whether paying people more income directly from the state is a good way of getting people out of poverty or creates dependency, bad incentives and so forth. And so there will be some obvious choices about things that some political parties would rule in and others would rule out, and about the short-term and long-term prioritisation of reducing poverty. We know that if you want to reduce poverty quickly, then the quickest thing is to get money into people's pockets in the poor category as rapidly as possible. But if you think that might have negative impacts on work incentives or might not address their lack of capabilities, then you might want to do things that spend money on interventions where you're not going to see the consequences for 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. And that's something where it would even be possible to have the same metrics, but actually to come to different conclusions about policies that should be prioritised.
And that's my final set of questions, is about ideology. I mean, in some ways, you could say the most critical you could be about this project is that it's part of a trend of quite technical responses to policy, which is ultimately quite a philosophical and political decision that people inside government make about this is our view about the state, or it's our view about the demographics in this country right now. And do you think that you possibly might have a government where they don't care, they ignore these metrics, they see the metrics going wrong and they say we've made a judgment? And do you think that's a goer? Or is you must believe that if this commission exists, it will be very politically pressurising?
Yes. So I think there are a couple of things in there. There's something that gives me hope. So the reason why I wanted to put this commission together in the first place was actually partly because of all the work that David and I did in government together anyway on the creation of new metrics, which I knew we could achieve cross-coalition. Secondly, actually, because of the work that I did with Alan Milburn on the Child Poverty and Social Mobility Commission as well. And actually, when we were behind closed doors talking and with Lib Dem advisors, and when Alan and I were behind closed doors talking and with sensible people in the Labour Party, actually there wasn't an awful lot to put between us. What you tended to find was a slight difference of emphasis. If I was talking to people on the left, they would say to me, Philippa, poverty is about income, but do you know what? It's also about all these other factors. And you saw that in the Opportunity for All documents that were done years ago. And then when I was talking to people on the right, they would say to me, do you know what? Poverty is about all these other factors, but do you know what? We will concede it's also about income. And that's why I kind of thought it cannot be beyond the wit of man to put us in a room if we work hard enough with each other and we really listen to each other and we try and unpack the kind of concerns that might lie behind some of our philosophical rhetoric, we might actually be able to come up with something decent. It can be ignored by government, but our intention is, once these metrics are created, is that we will be there after every spending review. We will be there after every budget. We will run the numbers through, and we will be a voice for poverty, whether or not the government actually takes action on it.
But Alan Milburn's commission is quite a good example. I think he has had his victories, most notably with the social mobility hotspots or cold spots, whatever they're called. But equally, there's a sense, just this week he brings out another report, and there's a sense that there's not always the urgency to deal with the problems. That he is describing the nation, but he isn't necessarily beating a path to Downing Street's door.
But I think that's possibly true. But I do know that, forgive me, Treasury people who are in the room, that the one thing that people in the Treasury don't like is the morning after the budget, having somebody running your own numbers and telling you the impact. Alan Milburn coming out, I think he's done a really good report, by the way. I think it's superb, his latest report. But coming out with these proposals, I hope it leads into the spending review, but it doesn't create the same accountabilities. And I think that's what's important.
So he's painting a picture rather than coming up with numbers.